Hi and good morning. Welcome back to Afternoon Literature. Okay, so this morning what I wanted to go through were my top 5 non-fiction reads. I don't often read non-fiction versus the amount of fiction that I read. I try to read a non-fiction book about once a month on a topic that I find either interesting or I think may teach me something that I don't know, about a place I don't know, or something intriguing. So my non-fiction books are kind of eclectic in that there's not one particular area I might look in, just a little range of areas that I think will give me something new and inform me in some way. I do think it's completely possible to learn a lot about different cultures, different places in the world, and different parts of history from fiction. I just like to supplement that with non-fiction sometimes. But in terms of actual non-fiction books and non-fiction reads, I tend to go towards journalistic non-fiction reads, culture-based non-fiction reads, versus going towards, say, memoir or biography. Occasionally I'll put those in, but it's just not as often, and I tend to get my non-fiction knowledge from articles and things online. But what I want to talk about today were the 5 non-fiction books that I have read that constantly come back into my mind, things that I talk about all the time, tell other people about, that I remember years and years after I have read them. Okay, so I've got my cup of tea. Firstly, some of the books that I am going to talk about today I don't actually have with me, and that's because they're the type of books that I like to share with people. And because of that, some of them just physically aren't in my presence. First book I'm going to start off with is the one that I read the longest time ago, and that is Wild Swans by Chang. Now, I am intending to do a reread of this at some point soon. You can see it's quite a chunky book, but what I do have to say is, chunky or not, this is incredibly easy to read and easy to get through. Wild Swans is about the 3 generations of women in China. So, as it says there, 3 daughters of China. So you're looking at a much older generation of women where we go through more traditional things. She went through foot binding and different things like that. And then you see the shift during the Cultural Revolution to communism and how that impacted China through the eyes of this family. And how the family then joined the Communist Party and moved into that part of the Communist Party, leading to the 3rd generation, the last generation, where I think it's Chang herself became a Red Guard within the Communist Party, and then what happened afterwards and why she stopped doing that, what it really meant, what kind of things happened during this time. That communism was there, especially like with the communist elite and the academics, and denouncing things and so on. And this is an incredibly interesting story. It really is a sweeping epic told through this multi-generational timeline, but it's also true, shockingly, surprisingly so, but also incredibly easy to follow. So Chang wrote this novel about her own experiences and the experiences of her family, and so it's a own voices novel, which also comes in my copy accompanied with some images and pictures, and I always like getting a little bit of that in non-fiction because it really does kind of ground you a little bit more. The writing is very simplistic to read, so it's really easy to follow, but I feel like this is a culture that is really often misunderstood. Either the really old aspect of this culture that we see through the grandma's generation is kind of idealized and mysticized almost. This idea of like a culture full of tiny bound feet and women who are oppressed and peasantry and farming, mixed with this idea of then the very regimented and harsh communist society, and a China we no longer know and we're no longer allowed access to. And actually having this story where we actually see the movement through history and the development of it is incredibly interesting. Now, I have read history-based novels based on this time, But what I found most enjoyable about reading it as a memoir was quite simply that because it's grounded in this family, you get to know them and that invests you. It's much easier to understand the history through the people. And to be honest, history books for me are incredibly dry and incredibly difficult to just read through and not enjoy but stay immersed in. By reading it through the frame of this family, you care about them, you get to know them, and then you start to understand and empathize more with their experiences. And so it gives you a really lived idea of what this history was actually like, because this is living history. This is history that is still remembered by people. It's not history from people who are now long gone and dead. And so it's important to remember that these are experiences that people actually still have very firmly ingrained in their memory, in their understanding, and it's still an immediate concern about a culture and a place that you might not know too much about. So yes, I'm going to read this again very, very soon, because I read Wild Swans, I think, when I was back in college, when I was like 16. So we are now 16 years ago. And it's still just as memorable now as it was then. I will do another video at some point, I think, on some fiction that I think relates to things like Wild Swans very, very well. So if you're interested in reading more Asian literature and finding out more about things like this time, other stories in a very, very similar vein, then watch out for that video soon. Okay, the second book on my list is also the book that I read, like not just after Wild Swans, but longest ago. And probably about 8 or 9 years ago now, I read this. And that is Being Mortal by Atul Gwande. So, Atul Gwande is a medical doctor who discusses the idea of death and mortality. This could have been an incredibly depressing read. Essentially, this novel here looks at, because we have a changing technology and a changing medical abilities, we are now all living longer. But what does that generally mean? We see the idea of living longer as always better, but is it? It does look at the idea of whether it's a drain on the economy, whether it's actually good for us and our mental health. How does it further the world, or does it actually stop part of being furthered? And generally, the more we are living longer, the more artificially our lives are extended. Well, is that good for us as people and our mental health and our ability to continue to function? At what point should we remember that we're mortal and stop trying to make ourselves immortal and push this further? Is it the point at which you can no longer go out and socialise easily? The point at which you can no longer walk? The point at which you can no longer remember things? What point do we accept that we are mortal? Like I said, it could be an incredibly depressing read, but actually it was so hopeful, so heartwarming, and so comforting. It really, really looks at the idea of what do we value in life and what should we value. Should we only value the extension of it, or do we need to value how we live a full life? Should we ignore things like we've created not the issue or the problem, but we are extending life, and so now we need to look at how to extend the quality of life rather than just the mechanical functions of it. There's a particularly good bit in here where it talks about revamping and changing the way we have nursing homes or care communities. As we are all extending our life for much longer, perhaps it's really important that we do change the way we run those communities, rather than them being places where we just stick old people so we no longer have to think about them or deal with them when they become too much of a burden. Maybe we need to recognise that actually there's value in an older person with all these experiences, and if you structure it in a different way, they don't become burdensome. They become someone who can still enhance your community and has an incredible wealth of knowledge on which to draw. For instance, in the care homes and nursing homes that Atul Gwande visits, they do projects where maybe there will be young children brought in, or projects where they have pets, and the older people look after those, because it gives them a meaning back in life. A lot of the time they were finding that the older people weren't so much dead or useless, just that they'd been forgotten and the quality and meaning to life had kind of gone. There was nothing for them to do, there was no place for them to function or fit, and without a purpose, well, that led to things like depression, and that led to ill health. But actually, with purpose and pride and a reason to live, the quality of life massively went up, and that also led to quality of health going up physically. It was really interesting to read this, and it's still memorable now. This is another one I think I would definitely like to reread sometime soon, because it has been a while. It also really helped to inform my opinion on things like how we see older people, how we need those things to function in society, but also how we see things like terminal illness, and how we see medical decisions, and at what point should you push and should you not. It's so well written, so well thought out, and like I said, very hopeful, which is a great thing. Okay, so now we are on to the book that I don't physically have with me. The first one of these that I want to talk about is one that I know has just had yet again another massive surge in popularity, and that is Why I No Longer Talk to White People About Race by Reni Eddo-Lodge. So I read this, I think, around 4 or 5 years ago, and I picked it up because it is a very interesting title. Race is not something that I talk about often, and that's not through a lack of not talking about it. So a little bit of background on that. I am from a very mixed ethnicity family. My granddad is from Barbados, my nan's family is from Ireland, my dad's family is from Scotland and England, and then I have members in my family who are of Jamaican heritage, Polish heritage, Turkish, Chinese, Vietnamese, and so on. So there is a massive range of us. It just led to a lack of discussion of race in our household, because we kind of just blended, and the times when we would talk about it, it would be more to do with cultural traditions and celebrating each other's cultural traditions or each other's food or things like that. So because of that, we just looked at it a different way. This was the first time I looked at something that really tackled the idea of race difficulties. Not because I'm ignorant of it. I've seen things from the civil rights movement. I have looked at things to do with Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, Nelson Mandela, and so on. We've looked at the Black history that we learned through Black History Month and the slave trade and things. But I just don't feel like it really told you anything about what modern day racism still was. And a few years ago, especially with Brexit campaign becoming a massive thing and so on, it just felt like it so came to a head, especially in Britain, and it was vital and important. And that's when I read this book. This book completely changed the way I think about and the way I look at race, and it really opened my eyes to some things. I think it's incredibly important that we are able to hear different opinions and different cultural ideas, but also that we are allowed to see different experiences. This book is split into sections that make it incredibly easy to follow. It's very easy to read and understand. I think the discussions of education were important. I think they showed me something about my own education that I hadn't really seen or realised until facing that now. So for me, I definitely come from a place of massive privilege. I'm very pale skinned. My sister looks very, very pale. So we didn't really get like a lot of the criticism or the looks that some people do get. We haven't experienced racism at all in the same way. And I know I've been in situations where I've been so white passing that there has been shock and surprise on seeing other members of my family, because people would not expect at all that my granddad was black or anything of the sorts. So I have definitely benefited from that, and benefited from the fact that I'm quite eloquent and well spoken. And so when I then started working in an inner city youth centre, and then went on to teach in an inner city college, I watched the surprise and shock register on my students' faces that actually I'm not white, and I come from the same poorer areas as they do. And I realised that in one way they can look up to me and I can be a role model, but in another way I have lived a completely different experience from them, and it was important that I understand that. And this book gave me a lot of that. It made me question things and look back at myself and really see where I had benefited and privileged from my own upbringing, from my own understanding, and from my own ability to kind of pass into certain areas without people questioning that. But also where there were definite inequalities in my society and upbringing, and the area that I work in, and how important it is that I continue to work in that area and ensure that these inequalities are brought to bear and fixed. A really interesting part of the discussion, I think, in why I no longer talk about to white people about race, is about intersectional feminism. The idea that, again, just because you are a woman does not mean you've had the same experience as a black woman, and so on, I think was incredibly interesting, because it's so easy to see how ignorant you can be, thinking that you are having the same experiences, and actually experiences are unique. They are made up of so many different areas that it's very difficult to ever really truly understand that or speak for someone else. And so it's so important that we do have different voices raised, that no panel on feminism is all white women, that no discussion on LGBTQ issues are all white people, that they are a mixture of people. And I do think it's important that we have not just white faces, not just black faces, but that we do start to see Asian faces there, that we do start to see mixed faces, because again, as I said, my experience is definitely different from white people, because my understanding of the culture, of the atmosphere is so different, and of growing up, my family dynamics is different, but it is definitely not the same experience that a black person will have had. And I think that is vitally important. I know that in the wake of George Floyd's murder and the protests, yet again, that this has become a book that is incredibly well selling, and incredibly important. But I would urge you not to just read the book and stop there. I read the book and then I listened to podcasts, and there were some incredible speakers on Reni Eddo-Lodge's podcast, particularly loving the episode where she speaks to Akala. There's another book that is on my reading list, which is Natives by Akala, which talks about race and empire. So something you should definitely pick up and look at. But the podcast also helped to continue these ideas. And then these are things that I'm now happy to talk about and to interrogate and discuss, and we need to keep doing that. The fourth book on my list is Another Day in the Death of America by Younge. Okay, this is a book that is written by a British journalist, Younge. He's a black British journalist who went to live in America, and he writes about his experiences there and the things that he has found. Now, he's written some of the books which would be very interesting. Some of them are on my read list. One or two I've already read. Stranger in a Strange Land is the one I think I'm going to go to next, where he talks about being in America as a black British journalist. But this book, Another Day in the Death of America, is one that still resonates with me now. And it is focusing on the idea of gun control in America. In this book, he looks at a 24-hour period and the deaths that occurred by gun violence within those 24 hours. Now, some of these deaths are actual gun violence, some of them are accidents and so on because of gun access, and he looks at people fighting for gun reform and also at some of the reasons why gun reform currently hasn't happened and things like the Second Amendment right. And as I'm not American, it's explained in there to you to a degree where you really can understand it. Now, for me personally, I'm a pacifist. I definitely advocate for things like the abolition of guns and so on. I don't understand at all why we have these in a normal society for people to just access. So it really was, to me, very, very confusing seeing this. The big time when gun control is talked about is obviously when we get mass shootings. Basically, when the worst happens, we then start to have these conversations and then nothing comes of it and nothing ever happens. And it's something that we bring up, and I know, speaking to my students, everyone gets really confused. Like, why don't they just ban guns? Why do they have them? And in the last 2 years, I've started to actually see students here become petrified of the fact that a school shooting might happen because it's so in the media and so common. Protesting happening because young people are having to drill on the fact that someone might walk into their college with a gun because you can buy them at the local supermarket. It's insane. So for me, I just can't understand that. And one of the things that most massively made me kind of comprehend this a little bit is that because it is a Second Amendment right, and the way it is ingrained in the Constitution and the culture in some societies in America, Gary Young cleverly equates it to the idea of driving a car. We have cars, and the intention of a car is not to kill people, but the possibility is there that it always could. And do we protest and ban a car when the car's death, when the car has caused a death, even if that is a massive car pileup? And that kind of like stopped me in my tracks, not because I agree with the argument, and that is not what Jung's asking you to do. Jung is, if you read it, is not asking you to agree with that argument, but what someone explained to him and what he then tries to explain to the readers is that is the way that guns are looked at in some parts of that society, where they are essentially just like having a car, and well, cars have the possibility to kill people, but you wouldn't ban them, so why would you ban guns? Now, obviously, for me personally, a car is not intended in its use to kill people. It's intended in its use to get you from A to B. Guns are intended in their use to kill people, and that is the difference. But when you get your head around the fact that that is the thinking behind it, starts to see the tangled web that really is this fight for a change to Second Amendment rights and a change to that Constitution. It was a really powerful read, but it was also heartbreaking. Gary Young looks at these 10 deaths in an incredibly emotive way. He tells you what happens, he tells you the story, and he tells you the aftermath. And as we know, gun violence affects many ages, and a lot of these are children and teenagers, and it is sad. But it's also an incredibly well-written book, well-researched, and it definitely taught me something that has been massively in the media, but which I do not understand very well. Gary Young also wrote some fantastic books on things like how Martin Luther King developed his incredibly famous I Have a Dream speech, which is a really interesting read, and also on identity and why who we are matters and things in the 21st century. He is a really brilliant journalist, and if you want to look at more works by Black writers, I would definitely suggest him in the future. Okay, that now brings me to my final book in my top 5. So my final book is We Wish to Inform You That Tomorrow We Will Be Killed with Our Families by Gourevitch. This book was heartbreaking. Gourevitch is an incredibly well-written journalist, very well-spoken. The book is very eloquent, very easy to follow, and simply explained. But in that element, it is incredibly harrowing because of this. This book focuses on the Rwandan genocide and looks at the lead up to it, how it occurred, the experiences of what happened during that genocide, and then the aftermath and how that has affected the country. It begins with Gourevitch detailing going to a site where there are there are skeletons. It's like a mass grave, essentially, where there are skeletons all over the place, and he is stepping over things, and he is stepping over bones and skulls of people who have just been left there to rot and decay, who are not buried but are there exposed for you to see, and he is literally having to step over them. It opens on such a powerful and emotively harrowing scene that it was difficult to continue to read, and I think I must have spent 60% of this book just in tears. He has interviewed survivors, he's found so much information out, and touchingly has been given so much access to their memories and their pain that he has then expressed. For me, this was a novel that was incredibly filled with humanity. This book was really important to get other people's voices out there and make sure you truly understood and heard what had happened to them and what they'd experienced. But it was also a book that really looked at how we as a society, as a world, reacted to this situation. This genocide was allowed to happen. We were complicit in it. We knew it was occurring. Bill Clinton in America was making speeches about it, ordering tanks but not doing anything. The UN stood by the sidelines with UN camps there but unwilling to go in, only evacuating their own people. It was on the news and we knew this was going to occur, and we allowed a country to commit genocide on our watch and did nothing to stop it. And it massively raises a question of why. Why would we allow a country to do that? Why would we not step in and try to help? Yet we step in and help in other places. We make it our business in other places to be peacekeepers and get involved, and we didn't here. When you see the harrowing, disturbing experiences, and we knew this was coming, it definitely does bring up those questions of race, responsibility, and colonialism. Do we really go around the world helping, or is it because we're helping places that have oil fields or weapons we want or money that we know supports and underpins our own nations? It's just heartbreaking, truly heartbreaking to see how little we are willing to do when it does not directly benefit us, and how many people we're willing to just allow to be used, how expendable we're willing to allow these nations to be. And yeah, there are movies on this, there are some very interesting TV programs and shows on it, but they are definitely for an eye, and I would honestly say this is one of the most eye-opening books that I have read that is unashamedly questioning the role that nations took in allowing this genocide to happen and continue, and not helping or assisting at all. This really does ask you to question yourself and the role that your own nation played in this. The only other book I've read by Gourevitch is Standard Operating Procedure, and that looks at the soldiers, particularly American soldiers, who were stationed at Abu Ghraib, and the abuses that they inflicted on prisoners there at a time of war, which I think kind of forms a counterpoint again against this, and it is something that's very interesting. This is definitely a book that I would suggest people read. I don't think it's something that people know as much about as they should, which is shocking considering that this genuinely happened within my living time and within my living memory. I wasn't that young and I knew nothing. Yeah, so I would definitely suggest going and getting we wish to inform you that that tomorrow we will be killed with our families. Just the title alone is so heartbreaking that it's hard right now not to cry, because that is a quote from a letter that someone is genuinely saying right now, that they need to tell you that we know we're going to be killed tomorrow and we just need to give you some information before that happens. So they are my top 5 favourite non-fiction reads. They are non-fiction books that have stayed with me, whether it's from 16 years ago, 8 years ago, or 3 years ago. Books that have changed my thinking, my knowledge, how I look at the world, and have informed things that I really want to continue to look into. I'm always looking for suggestions of journalistic non-fiction and reads, especially from places that I don't live. Britain and America are so intertwined, but even understanding American culture is different. I think we definitely have a different cultural awareness and different way of thinking, and so that's important. But seeing different cultures around the world is just massively important to me, and that's why I try to read as widely as I can. So if you've got any suggestions of other journalistic pieces that you think that I should read and look at, please give me a list, because I would absolutely love to be able to pick up some more from my shelves and keep reading through them. That is all from me today. If you like this video, please give it a like, and if you would like to see more from me, then subscribe down below. Have a good reading week, and I'll see you soon.